If you enjoy dark stories, unsolved mysteries, and tales that leave you with a strange feeling in your mind, subscribe to the channel now, because each story here might affect you more than the last. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The mansion stood isolated atop the hill, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to lean toward it, as if whispering secrets to the wind. Built in the late 19th century, the property was known in the region for its unsettling silence, a kind of quiet that brought not peace, but a constant feeling of being watched. It was there that the foreign princess, Elise Varnier, spent her final days. No one knew for sure why she had chosen that remote place in the United States. Some said she was fleeing scandals in Europe. Others, that she was carrying a cursed inheritance. The fact is that upon arriving, she brought with her few belongings, no trusted employees, and an expression that never seemed to relax. Thomas Hale was the first to notice that something was wrong. He was responsible for maintaining the neighboring property and occasionally received requests to inspect the structure of the old mansion. When Elise arrived, he was the one who opened the rusty gates and silently watched the modern carriage pull up before the main entrance. She descended alone, dressed in black, even under the pale afternoon sun. Without exchanging many words, he simply indicated that he desired absolute privacy. In the following days, Thomas noticed strange patterns. Lights would turn on at irregular times. At night, shadows would move behind the tall windows, even when there was no sign of activity during the day. And more than once he heard something coming from the direction of the mansion, a low sound, almost like a constant dragging. The city soon began to talk about it. The few residents avoided the road that led up the hill. Deliveries were left at the gate, never accepted in person. A postman swore he had seen the princess talking to herself on the balcony, gesturing as if responding to someone invisible. But what really changed everything happened on a stormy night. Lightning illuminated the mansion in irregular flashes, revealing its imposing yet decaying structure. Thomas, who had been awake by the sound of the wind, saw something that made him freeze. In one of the upstairs windows, a silhouette stood motionless. It wasn't the princess. She was too tall, too stiff, and it didn't move even when the lightning faded. The following morning, the news spread quickly. Elise Varnier had been found dead. The body lay in the great main hall, on the dark wooden floor. There were no clear signs of a struggle. No broken windows, no forced doors. Just silence, the same heavy silence that had always enveloped the place. Local authorities classified the case as an inconclusive death. But Thomas didn't believe him. He was called in to investigate a possible leak in the roof days after the incident. Upon entering the mansion, he immediately noticed that something was different. The air seemed thicker, almost difficult to breathe. The smell of old wood mingled with something metallic, subtle but persistent. As he walked down the main hallway, he heard that sound again. Dragging, this is it, coming from somewhere above. Thomas stopped. Instinct told him to leave immediately, but something stronger, a restless curiosity, compelled him to press on. Each step echoed too loudly, as if the house were too empty, or occupied in a way he didn't yet understand. Upon reaching the staircase, he noticed marks on the handrail, deep grooves, as if something had been pulled forcefully, repeatedly. He went up. At the top, the corridor stretched out in partial darkness. Some doors were ajar, revealing nearly empty rooms, but one of them was completely locked, and that's where the sound was coming from. Thomas approached slowly. The noise stopped. Absolute silence. He held the doorknob, free. For a moment he hesitated. His breathing was uneven, and a strange sensation ran down his spine. Not exactly fear, but an instinctive certainty that, by opening that door, something would change forever. Even so, he turned the doorknob. The door opened with a low creak. The room was empty, but not completely. In the center of the floor, there were marks, dragged lines, crossing each other chaotically, as if something had been moved repeatedly, or as if someone had tried to leave unsuccessfully. Thomas took a step back, and then he realized. The markings didn't lead towards the door. I went inside the walls, as if something had been pulled into the very structure of the house. At that moment, he knew that the princess's death had not been a simple accident, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she was never truly alone in that mansion. In the days following the discovery of the body, the mansion ceased to be merely an isolated spot on the hill. It became a place avoided with even greater conviction. The local police conducted a brief investigation, limited by a lack of concrete evidence. No sign of forced entry, no reliable witnesses. Just a cold report, filed away marked inconclusive. But outside of official documents, the story began to take on a different form. Thomas Hale couldn't walk away. Something about those marks, the silence of the room, and the constant feeling that something was hidden in the walls pulled him back. He tried to ignore it, occupying himself with routine tasks, but his mind kept returning to that closed door, that dragging sound, that absence that felt like a presence. That's when he decided to investigate on his own. The first clue came from old city records. The property had belonged to an influential family decades ago, the Whitmores. The patriarch, Edward Whitmore, was known for his reclusive behavior and for extensive renovations made to the mansion, many of them without detailed official records. After his death, the house remained abandoned for years, changing hands without ever being truly inhabited for very long, until Elise arrived. Thomas found more information about her in old international newspapers. Elise Varnier was not just a princess by title. She came from a European lineage shrouded in controversy. There were reports of family disputes, unexplained disappearances, and even unproven accusations related to occult rituals and practices. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise questions. Meanwhile, another figure began to stand out in the small town. Margaret Doyle, a local historian who had spent years documenting old properties in the region. Unlike the other residents, she didn't shy away from the subject. She seemed, in fact, overly interested in it. Thomas looked for her. Margaret listened attentively to his account, without interrupting. When he finished, she remained silent for a few seconds before standing up and pulling out an old box of documents. "This house has never been normal," she said in a restrained tone. She showed me old blueprints of the mansion. Some versions indicated corridors that no longer existed, walls thicker than necessary, and empty spaces between structures, areas that didn't appear as rooms, but clearly occupied internal volume, hidden spaces. "Whitmore had parts of the house sealed off without explanation," she continued. "But there are reports from long ago of noises coming from inside the walls, even before that." Thomas felt the discomfort growing. That meant that what he had heard was not recent, not even in isolation. Margaret also revealed something even more disturbing, records of former workers at the mansion who disappeared over the years. There were no in-depth investigations at the time. Many were immigrants or people without close family. They simply ceased to exist, and there was always a pattern. The disappearances coincided with periods of internal reforms, as if something was being hidden or fed. The relationship between Elise and the mansion was beginning to take on a darker tone. According to Margaret, the princess had requested access to historical documents about the property even before arriving in the United States. She knew what she was getting herself into. And, by all indications, he came there for a specific reason. In the following days, Thomas returned to the mansion, this time with a clear objective: explore. Upon re-entering, he noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. Small irregularities in the walls, subtle differences in acoustics when hitting certain surfaces. In some places, the sound was hollow, in others, completely solid, as if there were hidden layers. In the upstairs hallway, he found something new. One of the walls had a recent crack. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal something behind the structure. Oldest wood. It's dark, much darker than the rest of the house. He ran his fingers along the opening, and he felt it, a slight movement of air coming from inside, as if there were an empty space. Breathing. At that moment, Thomas was no longer dealing solely with an old house or the unexplained death of a woman. There was something structurally wrong with that place. Something that has existed for decades, perhaps longer, and that Elise, for some reason, had tried to find or to set free. As Thomas left the mansion that day, he realized he was no longer alone in his quest. Margaret had decided to help him, but not out of curiosity. There was something personal that interested her, something she hadn't yet revealed. And as the two began to put the pieces together, a silent certainty was forming. The mansion was not just a setting. He was an active part of history, and everything indicated that what he had started was not yet finished. Thomas returned to the mansion at nightfall. This time, he wasn't driven solely by curiosity. There was a growing sense of urgency. The recent discoveries not only hinted at mystery, but indicated real danger. Something in that house wasn't dormant, it was active, and perhaps by observing, Margaret insisted on accompanying him. She brought with her more powerful flashlights, an old camera, and copies of the mansion's blueprints with handwritten annotations. Some areas were marked with circles and arrows, points where, according to her, there were structural inconsistencies. "If there are hidden spaces, they must connect somehow," she said as they walked through the main entrance. The interior of the mansion seemed colder than before. Not just the temperature, there was an oppressive feeling in the air, as if the environment resisted their presence. Each step echoed with greater intensity, and the silence between those echoes seemed too long. Thomas led Margaret to the upstairs hallway. The crack in the wall was still there, but things had changed. It was bigger. Now, an irregular opening was clearly visible, as if the wood had given way from the inside out. The space revealed was dark, a different kind of darkness, too deep to be merely an absence of light. Margaret approached slowly. "It wasn't like this before, was it?" Thomas denied it. Without saying anything more, he forced the opening with his hands. The wood gave way with a dry crack, revealing a narrow space between the walls, a kind of makeshift corridor, or perhaps intentionally hidden. The air that came out of there was heavy, old, and it carried an odor that was difficult to identify. They exchanged a brief glance, and they went in. The space was cramped, forcing them to advance side by side, carefully. The interior walls were different, rough, uneven wood, marked by imprecise cuts. In some places there were deep scratches, like the ones Thomas had seen on the handrail, but there they were more numerous and more violent. After a few meters, the corridor widened slightly, revealing something that made Margaret stop. Objects scattered on the floor. Old people. Shoes, scraps of fabric, rusty tools, and something that looked like a broken chain. Thomas knelt down, examining the items. None of them seemed recent. Some were covered by a thin layer of dust. Others were not. "That doesn't make sense," Margaret murmured. "If it's been closed for decades." She didn't finish the sentence, because at that moment a sound echoed through the space, dragging, closer than before. Much closer. Thomas stood up quickly, pointing the flashlight ahead. Nothing. Only the corridor stretched out in the darkness, but the sound continued. This is it, irregular, as if something heavy were being moved with effort. They advanced, now with redoubled caution. The hallway made unexpected turns like an improvised labyrinth within the house's structure. At one point, they found a small side opening that led to a larger space, almost like a hidden room, and it was there that they found the first direct sign of Elise. There was a notebook on the floor. Open. The pages were filled with hurried notes, written in a mixture of English and French, diagrams, symbols, and references to parts of the mansion. Margaret flipped through it quickly. She was mapping it out, trying to understand the structure. Thomas pointed to a specific page. There was a detailed drawing of a central point in the house, marked with a dark circle. Next to it, a phrase was repeated several times. "They're not just walls." Before they could analyze it further, the sound returned, this time behind them. They turned around at the same time. The darkness seemed even denser, and there was something wrong with the space. The corridor they had entered through seemed narrower, as if it were closing up. "That's not possible," Margaret whispered. The air grew heavier. Thomas's flashlight flickered for a moment, and then they saw, for just a second, one way, high property, at the end of the hallway. But different from the silhouette seen previously, this seemed integrated into the structure itself, as if it were part of the house. The light stabilized, and there was nothing else. The sound stopped. Absolute silence. But now the conflict was no longer just about investigation. They were no longer trying to understand what had happened to Elise. They were trying to leave. Thomas held Margaret's arm. "We have to go back. Now." They began to retreat rapidly, but the path no longer seemed the same. The curves were different. The distances had changed. The space seemed rearranged, as if the mansion were changing or reacting. When they reached the point where they had entered, they found only a wall, solid, without any sign of opening. Margaret ran her hands over the surface in despair. No, this can't be." The sound is back, closer than ever, and this time it wasn't just a drag. There was another noise. Breathing, slow, heavy, inside the walls. Thomas then realized something that completely changed the nature of what they were facing. That wasn't just happening inside the mansion. That's what the mansion was like. And somehow, Elise had figured it out. But too late. The air inside that hidden space seemed to thin out with each passing minute. Thomas forced himself to remain calm, even as the erratic sound still echoed around them. The feeling of confinement didn't just come from the walls. It came from the realization that the environment was reacting. Margaret, despite her evident nervousness, remained focused. "If this has changed, then it can change again," she said, running her hands along the wall where there had once been an opening. "The house isn't static. It responds to something." Thomas remembered Elise's notebook. Quickly, he returned to the hidden room and began to leaf through the pages more carefully. The diagrams were not just maps, they were sequences, paths traced with arrows and repeated markings, like instructions, not to enter, but to cross. Margaret approached. She wasn't exploring, she was trying to get out. This realization added a new layer to the conflict. Elise hadn't been the victim of something unexpected. She knew where she was. She knew what the mansion hid. And at some point she became trapped in that living system of hidden corridors. But there was more. Between the pages, Margaret found a solitary note, almost hidden among scribbles. They heard it too. "Who?" Thomas asked. Margaret hesitated. It was the moment she had been avoiding until then. "My grandfather worked here," he said finally. "During one of the Whitmore renovations?" Thomas stared at her. She had never mentioned it before. "He disappeared," she continued, her voice lower. "Officially they said he left, but my grandmother never believed it. Before he vanished, he started hearing things inside the walls." The silence that followed was heavy. Now Margaret's interest was no longer merely historical. It was personal and deeply connected to what they were facing. Thomas turned his attention back to the notebook. The sequences drawn by Elise indicated patterns of movement, curves, pauses, returns. It wasn't random. It seemed like an attempt to track changes in the space itself. As if the interior of the mansion operated according to its own logic, or with a rhythm. "If we follow this, maybe we'll find a way out," he said. Margaret nodded, although the fear was still evident. They started moving forward again, this time guided by the notes. Each turn was taken with caution. Each pause was respected. At certain points, Thomas could swear the air shifted slightly after they followed the correct pattern, as if they were synchronizing their movements with something invisible. But not everything worked as expected. In one of the sequences, the path led to a completely enclosed space. No way out, no continuity. Margaret looked at the notebook again. She marked that as a mistake. Thomas observed more closely. There were several of these markings. Failed attempts. Paths that led to dead ends. And in some cases, something more. On one page there was a different drawing. It wasn't a map. He was quite a character. High, elongated, without clear details but with one distinct characteristic. It appeared to be merged with lines that represented walls, the same shape they had seen. She saw that too, Thomas murmured. Before they could continue, a new sound emerged, more aggressive, closer. It's different. This time, it wasn't just a slow drag. There was an impact. Like something being thrown against wood. From the inside, Margaret instinctively recoiled. "It's following us," Thomas did not answer. Because I knew it was true, but there was something even more disturbing. Looking back, they realized that the path they had taken had changed again, and they were no longer just lost. They were being escorted. With each correct sequence, they advanced. With each mistake, the environment seemed to react with greater intensity, as if there were a consequence. As if something were being tested or learning. Thomas felt an increasing weight in the decisions. That was more than just a labyrinth. It was a system, and Elise had tried to decipher it, but it failed. Margaret closed the notebook firmly. "There's one more thing," she said hesitantly. "In the old records, there was a theory." Thomas stared at her. Some believed that Whitmore wasn't trying to hide something from the house. She took a deep breath, but to nourish something within her. The silence that followed was broken by a dry crack. Very close, one of the walls next to them showed a slight deformation, as if something were pressing from the other side. Slowly, deliberately, the wood creaked, and a thin line began to form, a new opening. But this time it wasn't a ticket. It was something trying to get out. Thomas pulled Margaret back. The notebook fell to the floor, and the sound, now unmistakable, echoed through the space, breathing, faster, closer, more conscious. At that moment, any remaining doubt vanished. They weren't just trying to escape from an unknown place. They were inside something that reacted, learned, and hunted. And, by all indications, the more they understood about the mansion. But she understood them, too. The wood gave way with a violent crack. The crack in the wall widened a few more centimeters, revealing a darkness even deeper than the hidden corridor itself. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a density. As if that space shouldn't be seen, Thomas pulled Margaret, forcefully pushing her away. The breathing sound stopped abruptly. Silence, but not an empty silence. It was the kind of pause that precedes something. Then, without warning, the wall returned to normal. The opening disappeared, as if it had never existed. Margaret, breathless, stared at the spot where the crack had been. That answered our questions. Thomas did not respond immediately. His eyes were on the ground, in the notebook. He slowly bent down and picked it up, but something had changed. The pages were no longer the same as before. Some notes had disappeared. Others emerged. Margaret realized it at the same time. This wasn't here. A new page was open. In the center, a more detailed drawing than all the previous ones. It was the floor plan of the mansion, but not the exterior version. It was something internal, organic. The hidden corridors formed a pattern, not random, not even structurally. It was a body, lines curved like veins. The hidden rooms looked like organs, and in the center there was a prominent space, dark, marked with an intense repetition of lines. Thomas felt a chill run through his body. This isn't a map, it's a diagram. Margaret read the note beside her, written with more firmness than the rest. The core. Before they could react, a new sound emerged, unlike all the previous ones. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, it was everywhere. A profound displacement, as if the entire structure of the house were moving. The ground beneath his feet vibrated slightly, and then something happened. The corridor ahead of them opened up, not with a door, but as the wall itself slowly receded, it revealed a new path, wider, more defined, like an invitation or a drive. Thomas looked at Margaret. They both understood. That wasn't random. The mansion wasn't just reacting. "I was driving, taking them to a specific place. The core," she murmured. Thomas hesitated. Everything in his instincts told him to run away. But flee to where? The way back no longer existed, and for the first time there was a clear direction. They moved forward. The new hallway was different. The walls were more uniform, yet marked by repetitive patterns, deep grooves, as if something had passed over them countless times. The air was warmer and heavier. As they moved forward, they began to notice something disturbing. Objects, most recent, a piece of fabric that clearly wasn't old, a modern broken lantern, and then a shoe. Margaret stopped. He recognized it immediately. "That's hers," she whispered. It was one of Elise's shoes, slightly worn, recent. That meant the princess had reached that point, far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Thomas continued walking. Further ahead, the corridor widened again, and then they arrived. The central space, the core. It was no ordinary room. It was a circular void surrounded by walls that seemed to pulse slightly, not visibly but perceptibly, like a constant vibration in the air. In the center there was something, an irregular structure, dark and partially open. Thomas approached slowly. Margaret remained a few steps behind, and then he saw, inside the opening, something was trapped, a fabric, scratched. That's why. He recognized it immediately. It was the dress Elise was wearing the day she arrived at the mansion, but there was no body, just fragments, as if she had been absorbed. Margaret covered her mouth, horrified. "No, no!" Thomas took another step. And then he realized something even worse. The surrounding walls were marked, not just with risks, but with impressions. Like handprints, from the inside out, attempts to escape, hundreds of them, perhaps more. The air grew heavier, difficult to breathe. And then the sound returned. But now, it wasn't just one. There were several, whispers, low, overlapping, incomprehensible. Margaret began to back away. This is not a place." Thomas finished the sentence, almost without realizing it. "It's an organism." At that moment, everything made sense. The mansion, the reforms, the disappearances, Elise, everything pointed to a single truth. The house wasn't hiding anything. She was something, and whatever was there, it didn't just hold people captive. He consumed. The turning point was no longer about figuring out what happened. It was about understanding that there was no traditional way out, and that, if they wanted to survive, they would have to confront the very core of what the mansion had become. Because now, they weren't just inside her, they were part of it. The silence that followed in the core group brought no relief. It brought understanding. Margaret stepped back slowly, her eyes fixed on the marks on the walls, those handprints that looked as if they had been made in utter desperation. Some were small, others large, some overlapped, as if several attempts had been made in the same spot, as if no one had managed to get out. Thomas, on the other hand, did not move immediately. He stared at the center of the structure, that irregular opening where Elise's fabric still remained trapped. The slight movement in the air around it indicated that it was not static. There was activity, even if imperceptible to the eye. "She came all the way here," Margaret said, her voice faltering. "And she didn't come back." Thomas nodded, but his focus was no longer solely on Elise. He was beginning to connect with something deeper. "It's not just about arriving," he murmured. "It's about what happens when you arrive." Margaret stared at him, not fully understanding. But then something changed. The space around them reacted. The walls vibrated slightly, and the whispers grew louder, not in volume, but in presence. They became more distinct, closer, as if each sound were trying to form itself into words. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, and he listened. Not clearly, but enough. Fragments, called. And then, names. He opened his eyes abruptly. "They are here," he said. Margaret felt her body go cold. "Who?" Thomas looked at the walls again. "Everyone." The weight of it all fell upon them immediately. The people who disappeared, the workers, perhaps even Margaret's grandfather, Elise. They weren't just dead. They were incorporated, part of the structure, part of that system, and that changed everything. Margaret stepped forward now with a different expression, not just fear, but a mixture of pain and determination. If they're still here, then maybe... She didn't finish, but the idea had already been formed. Perhaps there was a way to free them, or at least to prevent it from continuing. Thomas noticed the change in her. "We don't know what this does to those who try to interfere," he warned. But Margaret wouldn't back down any further. She approached the central structure, observing the attached fabric. "Elise came here for a reason," he said. "She wasn't just trying to escape." Thomas also approached more cautiously. "She was trying to get to the core, maybe to stop it." The environment reacted again, this time with more intensity. The floor vibrated more noticeably, and the walls emitted a low, continuous sound, like an internal echo, as a warning or an answer. Margaret reached out toward the fabric. Thomas grabbed his arm immediately. "Wait." But it was too late. The moment her fingers touched the fabric, everything changed. The sound exploded around them. The whispers became voices, high, overlapping, desperate. The walls began to contract slowly, as if the space were being compressed. Margaret fell to her knees, putting her hands to her head. I can hear..." Thomas tried to pull her away, but something stopped him. He also began to listen, much clearer now. Memories, fragments of experiences that were not his own. Fear, lockdown, despair. And in the midst of all this, a different kind of presence, stronger, most recent, Elise. The realization came as a shock. It hadn't just been consumed. She was conscious within that situation, present, and trying to communicate. Margaret lifted her face, her eyes wide. "She's under arrest." Thomas nodded slowly. "And she's not alone." The environment continued to react, but now there was something new, a pattern. The vibrations were not random, and whispers, now voices, were beginning to align, as if something were trying to organize the chaos or resist it. Margaret gripped Thomas's arm tightly. "If she's still conscious, then she might know how to stop it." Thomas looked at the core again, but now with a different perspective. That was more than just a threat. It was also a prison, and perhaps a breaking point. But any attempt to interfere would have consequences. And they had already started something by touching that fabric. The space around them began to slowly close in. Not abruptly, but inevitable. As a reaction to an invasion or an attempt at change. Thomas pulled Margaret to her feet. "We have to decide now." She was still dazed but conscious. "Either we try to leave without knowing what we're leaving behind," he looked at the core, "or we stay and face it." The conflict was no longer just about survival. It was a choice, and any decision, it would come at a cost. The pressure around them was mounting. The walls moved slowly, almost imperceptibly each second, but enough to make the space feel narrower. The air seemed denser, harder to draw into the lungs. The sound, now a mixture of voices and vibrations, created a disturbing rhythm, like an out-of-beat heart. But for the first time since they entered there, Thomas did not back down. He slowly released Margaret's arm. "We're not going to run away," he said firmly. She stared at him, still shaken by the voices echoing in her mind. "If we do that, she'll stay here. Everyone will stay." Thomas nodded. Throughout the investigation, he had reacted, followed leads, avoided direct risks, sought explanations. But now there was no more room for simply observing. Action was needed, and that required something different. He picked up Elise's notebook again. The pages were still altered, but now they seemed more organized. As if, after contact with the core, something had been unlocked. The diagrams were clearer, the sequences more direct. Margaret approached. "That's changed again." Thomas ran his finger along one of the lines. "These aren't paths, they're answers." She frowned. "Answers to what?" He looked up. "What the house does when you interfere." Understanding came gradually. The mansion reacted, but it could also be influenced. Elise wasn't just trying to escape, she was trying to interact with it, to test limits, to find patterns of reaction, and perhaps exploit a weakness. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to concentrate despite the voices. "If this functions like an organism, then it has a sensitive point," Thomas nodded, "or a checkpoint." The new plan began to take shape. Don't run away, but forcing an answer. They turned their attention to the core. The irregular structure in the center seemed more active now. Small internal movements, subtle but constant, indicated that something there was reacting to their presence. Thomas examined the surrounding walls, handprints, the spots where the wood appeared thinnest. "These areas," he said, approaching one of the most heavily marked regions, "these are where there was the most resistance." Margaret understood. Attempts to leave, or points where the structure gives way the most. He raised the lantern and tapped it lightly against the wall. The sound was different, more hollow, more fragile, but at the same time, the reaction was immediate. The entire room vibrated with excitement. The voices grew louder, and the core responded with a stronger movement. Margaret instinctively recoiled. "That's annoying as whatever it is." Thomas, on the other hand, delivered another blow, stronger. The wood cracked slightly, and for a brief moment, the sound changed. The voices aligned, less chaotic, more targeted. Margaret put her hand to her head again. "They are trying," Thomas realized. "They react when the structure is affected." The idea became clear. If that was a system that kept everything contained, therefore damaging specific parts could weaken the control, but it would also provoke a reaction and possibly something worse. Margaret took a deep breath. "If we do this, we can set something free." Thomas stared at her. "Or prevent it from continuing." The silence between them was brief, but enough. They both knew there was no safe choice, just what's needed. Margaret picked up a tool that had fallen to the ground, a rusty metal bar. Thomas positioned himself beside her. "Together," he said. She nodded, and then, at the same time, they hit the wall. The impact echoed throughout the space. The structure responded immediately. The walls began to contract more intensely. The core pulsed more visibly. Voices became a disordered chorus of screams and whispers. But along with that, something new happened. One of the marks on the wall gave way. A small opening appeared, and from within it came something unexpected. With fresco. Different. Margaret's eyes widened. That's not from here." Thomas felt the same way. It was the first time that something external seemed to reach that space. A connection. Fragile, but it's real. He smiled for the first time since it all began. "So that's how she tried." Margaret looked at the notebook. "Creating flaws," Thomas nodded, "and use those flaws to break the system." But time was limited. The opening began to close slowly. And the reaction from the mansion was becoming more aggressive. The ground was shaking even harder. The walls were moving faster, and in the center, the core seemed to be reorganizing itself, as if he were trying to protect himself or to counterattack. Thomas gripped the bar more firmly. "We can't stop now." Margaret positioned herself again. "If we're going to do this, we have to see it through to the end." The fear was still there. But there was something bigger now. Purpose. For the first time, they weren't just reacting to what the mansion was doing, they were changing what she could do. And that was exactly what Elise never had enough time to finish. The small opening in the wall began to close faster. The fresh air disappeared along with her, as if the mansion itself were correcting a vital flaw. The space became dense, heavy again, suffocating. But something had changed. Thomas and Margaret now knew that it was possible to damage the structure. And more importantly, they knew that each instance of damage triggered a coordinated response. She defends herself, but it takes a few seconds, said Thomas, mentally reviewing what they had done. Margaret flipped through the notebook quickly, now searching for specific patterns. Elise marked these points here, she said, pointing to various areas around the core on the diagram. They're not random, they're tension zones. Thomas looked at the walls. The handprints coincided exactly with those points. Where else did they try to escape, or where did she try to break through? The plan began to take shape. Creating a single flaw wasn't enough. It was necessary to overload the system, forcing multiple ruptures at the same time. Margaret looked up. If we attack several points, perhaps she won't be able to react to all of them. Thomas nodded. And the core is exposed. The risk was obvious. The mansion's reaction had become more aggressive. The walls moved more frequently, the floor vibrated in irregular pulses, and the voices, now constant, created an almost unbearable psychological pressure. But amidst the chaos, something began to stand out, an organization. The whispers were no longer completely random. Some voices were repeated. They called. They were guiding. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. They are trying to help. Thomas realized the same thing. The voices that had previously seemed confused now indicated subtle directions, small impulses. Turn left, stop, move forward, as if the consciousnesses trapped inside were somehow influencing the space. And among them, the presence of Elise. Stronger, clearer, not as words but as intention. Margaret opened her eyes. She wants us to continue. Thomas took a deep breath. Then let's finish what she started. They split up. Thomas went to the right side of the core, where the markings were deeper. Margaret went in the opposite direction, guided by the notes and voices that now seemed more insistent. Every move was calculated, every step observed. The environment reacted constantly, small contractions, subtle changes in structure, as if trying to anticipate his actions. Thomas found the first point. The wood was weaker. He lifted the metal bar, and he struck. The impact reverberated powerfully. The core team responded immediately. An intense pulse shot through the space. But this time, Margaret also attacked. On the other side, another impact, another mistake. The system hesitated. For a brief moment, the reactions overlapped, as if the mansion couldn't decide which damage to prioritize. "Now!" shouted Thomas. They continued, blow after blow. Each impact created new cracks. Small openings appeared, some letting in outside air, others revealing deeper layers of the structure. The voices grew louder, but not in despair, in intensity, like a chorus gaining strength. The core began to change. Its uneven surface contracted, trying to protect itself. The surrounding walls moved more violently, attempting to close the open spaces. But it was too late. The system was overloaded. Margaret stepped back for a second, observing the center. It's working, but it's not enough. Thomas noticed it too. Faults would appear, but they would close too quickly. Something more was needed, something straightforward. He looked at the notebook one last time, and then he saw a brand they hadn't used before. In the center of the diagram, right at the core, a different symbol, darker, more insistent. Margaret approached. That she didn't try? Thomas shook his head slowly. Or he tried and failed. The silence between them was brief, but full of meaning. Attacking the core directly would be different. It wouldn't just be about provoking a reaction. It would be confronting the very core of everything, and possibly unleash something they couldn't control. The walls began to close in again. Faster now. The space was shrinking. Time was running out. Margaret gripped the bar tightly. If we stop now, all of this will continue. Thomas looked at the core. He felt the weight of all the voices, of all the presences trapped there. And then he decided, let's finish. They moved forward together, straight to the center. The entire environment reacted. The walls vibrated violently. The sound became deafening, and the core, it pulsed, as if he knew what was about to happen. The climax was near, and this time, there was no turning back. The first strike to the core produced no sound. It produced a reaction. The instant the metal bar struck the dark structure, the entire space seemed to collapse for a second, not physically, but sensorially. The air left Thomas's lungs, his vision blurred, and the voices fell silent. Absolute silence, and then everything is back, with violence. The core pulsed violently, pushing an invisible wave that threw Thomas and Margaret backward. They crashed onto the uneven ground, while the surrounding environment warped more aggressively than ever before. The walls were no longer just moving, they were closing in, fast, desperately. "Get up!" shouted Thomas, pulling Margaret up. But something was different. The core had reacted in a direct way. Its surface began to open up, not like before, now in a controlled manner. And from within, something emerged. Not a defined creature, but one way, high, distorted, made of layers, as if composed of fragments of everything that had been absorbed. The voices have fallen silent again, replaced by a single presence, consistent, heavy. Margaret froze. That is... Thomas did not answer, but he understood. That wasn't just the organism. It was the central consciousness, the result of everything that had been incorporated over time. And now I was aware of them. The shape moved, not walking, but by rearranging the space around him to get closer. The walls receded and advanced as she moved. Thomas pulled Margaret back. We agreed on this. The presence stopped, and then something happened. A subtle change. Within the form, there was movement, fragments, like faces, expressions trying to emerge. Margaret put her hand to her head. They're in there. The voices have returned, but not like before. Now they were contained within that form. Dams, mixed, and among them Elise, stronger, clearer. For a moment the form hesitated, as if something inside her was resisting. Thomas realized. It's not just one thing, Margaret finished with difficulty. It's a living prison. Understanding brought about an immediate change. It couldn't simply be destroyed, because destroying the core meant destroy everyone who was inside it. The form advanced again, faster now. The surrounding structure closed in even further, compressing the space. There was no time. Thomas looked around, desperate for an alternative. And then he remembered. The standard, the reactions, the flaws. He gripped the notebook tightly. It's not about destroying, it's about breaking the control. Margaret looked at him, confused. If this is a system, then this thing is the center that holds everything together. The shape was coming closer. The air vibrated intensely. If we destabilize her, maybe the rest will fall into place. Margaret hesitated. Either everything collapses with us inside. Thomas stepped forward. For the first time, not backing down. She's still in there, he shouted, pointing to the shape. They all are. The presence reacted. A sudden movement. As if he had understood, Margaret gripped the metal bar. He took a deep breath, and he decided, so we don't destroy it. She raised the bar. We break her from the inside. The form progressed, quick, almost catching up to them. And then they attacked, not the center, but the layers. Targeted attacks, in the areas where the fragments appeared most unstable. With each impact, the form reacted. He was convulsing. The voices exploded in chaos, but something different was happening. Some of them separated. For a brief moment, small distortions appeared around the shape, like cracks in the air, and through them, light, weak, but it's real. "It's working!" shouted Margaret. The form reacted with even more violence. The walls began to collapse. The ground gave way in parts. The core group was trying to regroup, but he could no longer maintain stability. Thomas continued, blow after blow, ignoring the risk, ignoring the fear. With each impact, more cracks appeared, more voices were being freed. More light was passing through the space, and then the form stopped. For one final moment, silent property, and for the first time, Clara, inside it, multiple faces, multiple consciousnesses, and in the center, Elise. Their eyes met, and without words, she nodded, as if he knew, as if he accepted it. Thomas raised the bar one last time, and with everything that remained, he delivered the final blow. The form broke, not with a sound, but with his absence, a silent collapse, and then light, total, consuming everything. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same. Thomas opened his eyes slowly, his gaze obscured by a pale light coming from above. Air returned to his lungs with difficulty, as if his body were relearning how to breathe. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He just felt. The ground beneath him was solid, cold property. When he finally managed to stand up, he realized where he was, the grand hall of the mansion, the same place where Elise's body had been found. But now it was different. The walls were intact, without cracks or deformations. The air was no longer thick. The silence, though still present, no longer carried that oppressive feeling. Margaret was lying a few meters away. Thomas ran towards her. "Margaret!" She opened her eyes slowly, confused but conscious. "Did we go out?" Thomas looked around. He hesitated. "I think so." But there was something strange, too good, too simple. He helped Margaret to her feet. They both surveyed their surroundings carefully. There were no signs of what they had faced, no openings, no hidden corridors. The mansion looked normal, or at least abandoned. They walked to the main door. This time, she opened up without resistance. Outside, the sky was clear. The storm had passed. A light breeze rustled the trees around the property. Everything seemed normal. Margaret took a deep breath. He finished. But Thomas did not answer. Something still didn't fit. He turned his gaze towards the mansion. The windows on the upper floor reflected the daylight. Real estate. Empty. But for a brief second, he had the impression of seeing movement. Very subtle. Like a shadow that shouldn't be there. He blinked, and there was nothing else. Margaret was already walking away, descending the path from the hill. "Let's go," she said without looking back. Thomas hesitated, but he followed her. In the days that followed, the mansion was cordoned off by the authorities. This time, not as a simple, inconclusive case. Internal structures were analyzed. Some areas showed signs of old modifications, double walls, enclosed spaces, but nothing that fully explained what had been found or what had happened. Elise's case has been reopened. But again, no definitive answers. Margaret returned to her routine, though visibly different, quieter, more introspective. She never again spoke openly about what she had seen, but he kept the notebook. Saved. Thomas tried to do the same, keep moving forward. But something had changed, not just in memory, but in perception. Sometimes, in places that were too quiet, he could still hear them, no voices, but echoes, distant, almost non-existent, and at certain times, called. One night, weeks later, he decided to return to the hill, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The mansion was there, property, as it always has been. He approached slowly. He stopped in front of the door, and he remained silent, waiting. Nothing happened. No sound, no reaction. The house seemed empty. Thomas took a step back. He took a deep breath. And for the first time, he felt that perhaps it had truly ended. But as he turned to leave, something caught his attention. a small mark on the wooden door, recent, a thin line, like a groove. He ran his finger over it, and he felt it, a slight movement. Almost imperceptible, as if something was still there, observing, waiting. The mansion no longer seemed alive, but also she didn't seem completely dead. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth of all. Some things just don't disappear, they just change shape. Months later, the mansion remained untouched. No new residents, no visitors, just silence. But on an ordinary night, a car stopped in front of the gate. A man came down carrying a briefcase. He observed the house for a few seconds and smiled discreetly. Inside the folder were recent documents, updated floor plans, and a new name as the owner. Before leaving, he jotted something down in a small notepad. Stable structure, core, possibly active. He looked up once more at the mansion, and in the reflection of one of the windows, for a brief moment, something seemed to move, but he wasn't scared. He just got in the car, and he left. What if that mansion was never just a place, but something that learns, observes, and waits for the right moment to act again? The story of Elise, Thomas, and Margaret may have come to an end. Or perhaps it was just the beginning of something much bigger and older than anyone could have imagined. Now I want to know from you, do you think they truly destroyed what was there, or did they merely weaken something that is still alive? What would you do if you were in their place? Would you run away or face them to the end? And even more unsettling, would you have the courage to enter that mansion? Leave your theory in the comments. The most interesting ones might become new stories here on the channel. And if you enjoy dark mysteries, macabre stories, and mind-bending tales, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me, where are you watching from? Because the next story might be closer to you than you think.